Thank you for tuning in. This is Craig Soden. Thinking about gender with regards to culture, history, and religion is extraordinarily important for anyone who wishes to be a part of creating a better future. How we discuss gender matters, and how young people are taught to think about gender is a process that should always be ongoing. Kaya Oakes' book, The Defiant Middle, How Women Claim Life's In-Betweens to Remake the World, is about how women are expected to be many things. They should be young enough, but not too young. Old enough, but not too old. Creative, but not crazy. Passionate, but not angry. They should be fertile and feminine and self-reliant, not barren or butch or solitary. Women, in other words, are caught between social expectation and a much more complicated reality. Kaya Oakes is the author of 4 books, most recently including The Nuns Are All Right and Radical Reinvention. Her 5th book, The Defiant Middle, How Women Claim Life's In-Betweens to Remake the World, is out now from Broadleaf Books, and it is this book that is the topic of our conversation. The book draws on the wisdom of women mystics and explores how transitional eras, or living in marginalized female identities, can be both spiritually challenging and wonderfully freeing, ultimately resulting in a reinvented way of seeing the world and changing it. You can find Kaya Oakes online at oakstown.org and on Twitter at Kaya Oakes. Thank you so much for listening. Kaya Oakes, thank you so much for joining me today for a conversation.
It's great to be with you.
I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment and introduce yourself to our listeners, however you see fit.
Sure. My name is Kaya Oakes, and I teach writing at the University of California, Berkeley, where I teach creative nonfiction and also expository and research writing. And I live in the Bay Area, which is where I grew up. And I am a journalist and essayist and author of books about the intersections of religion and feminism and culture and politics and lots of other fun stuff.
Wonderful. That's really interesting that you are a lifelong Bay Area person. I'd imagine you've seen a tremendous shift in the region over the last, number of years, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, it's totally unrecognizable in some ways.
Yeah.
The campus at Berkeley even has changed dramatically since I started teaching there, just because they're constantly tearing down earthquake unsafe buildings.
Wow.
And trying to replace them.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. Well, I found you through the world of religious studies and higher education through our mutual friend, Dr. Liz Bucar at Northeastern University in Boston. And so I was delighted to make that connection through Dr. Bucar with your work, and your work is brand new to me. But I'm curious about where this interest in thinking, speaking, and writing about religion specifically originates. Like, how did you become interested in these areas that you write about?
I had a very unusual kind of winding path to becoming a religion writer.
Mm-hmm.
I was originally a music critic, and
Cool.
I was an arts journalist. And so my first nonfiction book that came out 12 years ago, I think, was about indie music and the whole DIY movement of the 90s and early 2000s. And then somewhere in there, I decided I was interested in particularly examining Catholicism, because I grew up Catholic and I went to Catholic schools, but I kind of took a break from it for 20 odd years. And I got back interested in it because I discovered the stories of the Catholic worker movement and Dorothy Day, who was mysteriously left out of my Catholic education. And Dorothy Day was a journalist herself and somebody who also, thought about religion as being interwoven with her political beliefs. And so that really appealed to me. And I decided to write and think about how religion intersects with our lives today.
I love that you're interested in music as well. I have another podcast too about a Canadian punk band And that whole scene and era of me for me is super important as well. Like, and I grew up working at record stores and music venues and playing in bands, and then so
Mhm.
I love that we sort of have a love of underground DIY punk and rock and roll in our backgrounds as well. That's a lot of
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. And it's not that common. And it's, I've found in the religion world, there's not that many old punks.
Yeah,
So,
love it. Yeah, I'm going to shout out my friend Vicky Brennan too. She's a professor in Vermont, and she's super into punk rock as well. So hi, Vicky. So you have a brand new book that I have been reading. It's called The Defiant Middle: How Women Claim Life's In-Betweens to Remake the World. And I just have to tell you something here really quick about my experience of reading this book. For the last 2 or so years, I have struggled tremendously with my own attention span with regards to
mm,
reading books. And I opened up your book and I was like thinking, okay, I'm going to get 5 pages in here. I'm going to get 5 pages in there. But before you know it, I had read like 75 pages in a row, which is the longest streak of reading that I have had since 2019. So your book is like sort of recalibrating my reading mind. And I just wanted you to know that as a person who has struggled to read tremendously for the past couple of years, that your book captivated me. So in that book, you talk about women who are young, but not too young, creative, but not crazy, passionate, but not angry. And so I'm the father of a young girl, and
mhm.
I'm also a man who has had friendships with women who have told me these types of stories in blunt detail and personal conversations. But this book has been tremendously impactful so far for the reality of women balancing in those in between spaces. So the spectrum of like social expectation comes into play here. And I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit more about your own coming to terms with your understanding of this middle of which you speak.
Well, the book originated in an essay that I wrote for the website of On Being, the podcast
Mm,
with Krista Tippett.
great podcast.
Yeah, she used to run essays on the website, and I wrote a few. And at one point, I think it was when I was in mid 40s, late 40s. So just a few years ago, I wrote an essay for her about how discovering. So I discovered that Hildegard von Bingen started writing books in her 40s.
Oh, cool.
And that was really interesting to me. And it led me to this kind of argument or idea that if we look at people like Hildegard and Joan of Arc and Julian of Norwich and other medieval women, that they can help us to sort of understand liminal periods in our own lives when we're caught between expectations and reality. And that essay was particularly about women in in their 40s and early 50s, and it went surprisingly viral. Religion writing usually does not.
Yes.
But I had a lot of people were sharing it and talking about it, and so it tapped into this thirst that people have for language and ideas about how to navigate those spaces between expectations and reality at different phases of life.
Gotcha. I'm curious about the sections as well, because you have old, young, crazy, things like that. So, like, tell me about how the content and the sections of the book came into being. Like, how did you develop like the organizational structure of these different sections?
Well, it was very random. So I wouldn't use this example in one of my own classes but I try to be honest with my students about my own writing process. But I signed the book contract in February of 2020. So we all know what happened next, which is
Yes.
that, yeah. So I was during the first COVID lockdown, I had the book contract and I knew sort of what the theme of the book was going to be, but I didn't have an outline. I had a sort of rough idea, but so I went down to my garage and I was riding my exercise bike,
Mm.
like we all were during the first COVID days. And I just thought about, what are some general ways in which women are expected, general things that women are expected to be. So I thought, fertile, nurturing, caring, someone who's takes care of other people, self-sacrificing, calm, collected, all of that stuff. And so the chapter titles are sort of like roughly sort of lumping these different expectations into different chapters.
Wonderful. Are there any like catalyst moments from your life that sort of like reinforced the way the book came together? Like, were there any like moments of your life where it's like, oh, right, this happened to me, so this informs my understanding? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. I turned 50 right as I started to write it. So I definitely was feeling that. I had the pandemic birthday. I too, actually, because I just had another one. And then also before I turned 50, I had some pretty serious health issues that ended in me having surgery. And it changed a lot of the way I think about gender and how we define gender, because
Yeah.
I lost my reproductive organs.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, one of the things they don't tell you before you have that surgery is that there are lots of trans men out there who've had the same surgery. And I happened to meet one of them pre-surgery, and he and I were talking, and he was super helpful and kind and thoughtful. And it just, again, helped me to think that a lot of how we define gender and what we expect of gender is so divorced from the reality of bodies. And so that we need to step back and kind of rethink that a little bit more.
Yeah, I found that section of the book particularly moving as well, and very honest and forthright. Which is, I mean, did you feel at all strange about talking about that in the book? Something that was so personal to you? Was that a hard decision to make, or were you like, this is definitely what I have to say?
Yes and no. I'm very mindful of the fact that women are often expected to write about trauma and to perform trauma in
Mm,
our writing. And I think that that's kind of dangerous in some ways. But I also knew that there wasn't a larger conversation about the issue of hysterectomy surgery or oophorectomy, which is ovary removal. And I was so unprepared for it that I wanted to be frank about it so that other women who might be facing, or any other people who might be facing the same surgery, would know that it changes you, but it's not the end of the world, and your life goes on. So it was a little back and forth of like, do I really want to go there? And I'm going there.
yeah. Well, I have to tell you that I've already recommended the book to somebody that I know who is doing the exact surgery that
Oh,
you had.
wow.
So it mattered to me that I found that, because it helped me to possibly be a better friend in that moment.
That's great.
Yeah. So you start the book. Everything on this podcast comes back to religion for me. So I'm going to kind of circle back to religion here and there as we talk. But the book starts in church. And I'm curious about a little bit more about your religious situatedness. And if you can tell me about the reason or reasons behind the choice of starting the book and hooking the reader in church.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was raised in an Irish Catholic family. I would say Roman Catholic, but Irish Catholics are different than Roman Catholics because there's so much enculturation of the religion in the family. And much like other people with immigrant backgrounds, the experience of religion changes when you come to the United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I say that as background because I write for America Magazine, which is the national magazine of the Jesuits, and I write for Commonweal, which is another Catholic edited magazine. And when I write for other places, I'm often asked by editors to write pieces about the Catholic Church. So it does play a big part in my life. And I wanted my publisher is Lutheran, which
Hmm.
is pretty funny when you think about it.
Yeah, it
Just,
is.
yeah. So, but they are affiliated with the ELCA, which is the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is the progressive, very progressive Lutherans. And so I knew I was going to be able to talk about things that I couldn't talk about with a Catholic publisher. And that was very liberating. And it allowed me also to be vocally critical of some things about the Catholic Church that I'm not always able to write about in other places. So,
Wow.
yeah, so that was part of the positioning.
That actually delights me tremendously that you were able to have that experience of, writing in a different style and saying some things that you wouldn't otherwise get the chance to. That actually really makes me happy. And it kind of reminds me of like my punk rock days, you know?
Yeah, the Lutheran punks.
Yeah, I love it. So let's talk a little bit about like some general imagery from church, right? In the book, you write about the imagery and purity of Mary. And having grown up in the church and waxed and waned a little bit, it sounds like in your own practice over the years, but also being raised with this really specific image of purity and expectations growing up. I'm wondering if you can contrast the original image of Mary with what you discover later on in life about Mary.
Yeah, I was asked by Religion News Service a couple of years ago. One of the editors there asked me to write a reflection on Mary for Mother's Day, and I was like, oh no, I don't want to write about this like meek and mild, plaster statue that I met as a
Yeah.
child. And so what I ended up writing about was a lot of what went into the book, which is the idea of reclaiming Mary as a revolutionary. Because if you read the words to the Magnificat, it's very political. And I recently was on a podcast hosted by two uh, people who grew up evangelical,
Hmm.
and they told me something really interesting, which is in their churches they didn't read the second half of the Magnificat. So the
Mm.
first half is all about Mary being humble and bowing before the Lord who's chosen her, and then in the second half she gets into God wants to wants the rich to be sent away hungry and the poor to be fed, and so they were sort of given this edited version of her. And so my own reading of feminist theology on Mary, and particularly Elizabeth Johnson's book Truly Our Sister, which is a re-examination of Mary, it really helped me a lot with divorcing myself from that kind of inattainable ideal Mary.
I love that. Well, and I'm getting a little bit of ideas for where I can expand my own learning here with a couple of titles there. So
Mm-hmm.
wonderful. Something that really captures my attention about this book is you referred earlier to your interests in Hildegard, Julian of Norwich, Joan of Arc. So you have this medieval undercurrent within this book, which is super fascinating. And I'm wondering just what specifically it is about like the medieval period that captivates your attention for writers and for readers here now in the year 2022. Like, how do you feel about this time period and relating these very distant past figures with readers in the here and now?
To me, it's just so fascinating how much we do and don't have in common. And also, I give a shout out to another new book called The Bright Ages by two historians, and they're sort of rethinking the medieval era as
Oh, cool.
well. And I really, when I discovered Hildegard, Julian of Norwich became, as you've read the book, she became really important to the book as well, because I was thinking, like many people during the pandemic, about isolation. And because she lived in an anchor hold, which is a cell attached to the side of a church, that she really lived and during several waves of the plague, which she may have actually had herself.
Mm.
She's really became, kind of the patron saint of the pandemic for a lot of people. But she also was a mystic, and so were Joan of Arc and Hildegard and Marjorie Kemp and many medieval women. So they were visionaries. And today we wouldn't have, I mean, everybody, probably has their own private visions that they don't share.
Hmm.
But I thought it was really interesting that all of these women tapped into that visionary side of themselves because of the circumstances that they were under, of living through plagues and wars and so on and so forth. It felt very familiar.
How were they sort of outliers within the culture in which they lived? Because we know their names today, so obviously their legacies live on. But what did they have to do in order to stand out amongst what was expected of them in that time and place?
Well, literacy was a big part of that. So the fact that most women could not read or write, Joan of Arc's trial transcript is how we come to know her and what she thought and what she said. She herself could not read or write, as far as we know. And so that lack of ability to communicate meant that women relied on other people, usually men, to transcribe their ideas. So someone like Julian, who's the author of the first book by a woman written in the English language, is very unusual in that way. But I think that what they all represent is, as going with the theme of the book, is this kind of defiance of church leaders. Joan and Hildegard both, spoke out against corruption in the church, and Joan of Arc was, of course, killed because of her visions and her prophetic voice. And then, Julian being defiant by exiting the world and choosing to step away from it. So yeah, all of them have that kind of streak of counterculturalism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it. Well, there's a term in the book that you mentioned a couple times that I have never heard of, and that's selva obscura. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you can just tell me a little bit about this term because I've never heard it before.
I picked it up from the stories of King Arthur, and and the story. I mean, there are a lot of medieval stories of questing knights. I just saw the the Green Knight, by the way, which is fantastic.
Mm.
It's a great re-envisioning of this whole era and of quests, and just a really great movie. But these questing knights would often, the famous one is Lancelot, so he goes mad in the woods, and questing knights would often enter the woods and then go crazy. And in Dante's Inferno, the dark wood is referred to as that he enters as well, is called the selva obscura. So like, it's the place where you go and get lost when you're at a transition point in your life. And I thought that idea was so perfect.
Wonderful. Thank you. So jumping forward to today, you refer to the hemming in of social expectations regarding youth, age, anger, fertility, independence. And it also got me thinking about the time and place and the challenges of right now in the last
Mhm.
couple of years that we've all been living through. You referred to the pandemic earlier, and it reminds me of sort of like the unevenness of household expectations, of parenting, etc., which has been widely reported during the pandemic about homeschooling and everything.
Mhm.
And it tends to fall more squarely on the shoulders of women, which has been reported and demonstrated over and over again for the last few years. And it got me thinking about how amazingly it seems like a reinvention for women is going, but how when the going gets really tough, the old ingrained expectations spring right back up, often exponentially. And I'm wondering if you can tell me about what you've noticed during the pandemic with relation to some of the themes in the book with regards to gender expectations and things like that.
One of the first surprises was when we had to move to Zoom. That I have many colleagues with young children, and that all my female colleagues with young children would have the kids would be crawling all over them during meetings and interrupting them. And my male colleagues with young children, the children were never seen or heard. So somebody
Mm,
else, and no offense, they're great guys,
yeah.
but somebody else was taking care of the kids at that moment. And it was most likely their wives. So that was really interesting, but I think it's a metaphor also for how there's this sort of like, I'll take care of it. I think again about that viral video of the guy who's on the newscast, and like the baby comes in and then the
Yeah.
toddler comes in, right? And,
Yeah.
and then the wife comes in and she's
Like
like,
screaming in.
yeah. It
I
was
love it.
so perfect, right? Because it captures again behind the scenes, but also like the woman sort of like, oh, crap, I got to take care of this. And
Yeah.
for us, sometimes that is really an issue of deconstructing your own uh, tendency to be that person who rushes in and puts out the fire, or who takes care of cleaning up, like no one else is cleaning this mess, I guess it's my job. And I'm married myself. No kids, but I'm married to a dude, and he and I talked a lot about deconstructing our own stereotypes of gender during the pandemic. Like, I'm expected to cook and he's expected to take care of the yard. And, why is that? Why do we do these things? And so we really worked on reversing some of those ideas within our own minds and changing our relationship.
Wonderful. Well, I'm also the parent of a young girl, and the youth section is powerful because I'm a teacher and a dad. So, like, my life is constantly surrounded by youth. And when I look at the generation of people behind me,
Mhm.
I see hugely powerful ideas about how to make the world a better place. So you bring up some very famous names in the book, like Greta Thunberg and Malala Yousafzai.
Mhm.
They inspire me because I know they will offer far more to the world than I really ever could or will. And I'm wondering what you learned about being considered too young to get world leaders to take someone seriously. I'm curious about your thoughts there.
That chapter sort of gets into Joan of Arc too. So I want to start with her just
Sure.
because she is a mirror held up to, I mean, thank God, Malala survived, but, the Taliban she was shot in the head, as we know, and it was because she was very dangerous and threatening. And Joan of Arc, same thing. And I would bet that Greta Thunberg's family has probably had death threats and some scary stuff that we may not have heard about. But it's interesting because and I was talking about this with my students too, with Gen Z. A lot of people are sort of, oh, they're going to fix these problems, right?
Yeah.
Like they'll fix the environment, they'll fix democracy, they'll go vote and fix politics, and so there's this tendency to dump things onto the next generation, and I think they're getting it really bad, like worse than we did in Gen X or than millennials did. But we also kind of dismiss them as immature. So there's this mutual thing of like, fix the world for us, but also you're too young to understand these
Mhm.
things. And so young adults and young women live in a dichotomy too. They live in a liminal space where they're neither grown up nor children. And that's a hard place to be. And also we put a lot of pressure on them. I think it's ridiculous that we expect 18-year-olds to know what they want to do with the rest of their lives. And
Yeah.
when they go to college, choose a major that will help that you can make money from, rather than take 2 years and explore different classes. And the pressure to know from when you apply to college to when you graduate exactly how your life is going to turn out, I find very problematic too.
Yeah, and I think about this a lot as well, because whenever I see somebody like Greta, I see somebody actually trying to make the world inhabitable for generations to come, when the current generation who has caused so many of the issues are long gone, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think that she just makes powerful people feel incredibly insecure, because they know how complicit they are.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to numb themselves and keep themselves numb, they dismiss her because they know in their hearts that they are failures and that they
Mm-hmm.
will never live up to any kind of substantive expectation. So I see somebody like that as like just calling out the deepest insecurities of current world leaders. Does that make sense?
It does. And one thing I really like about my students is their unwillingness to tolerate bullshit excuses from people,
Yeah.
whether that's me
Yeah.
or their parents, but more, they tend to be very blunt, and they're very sarcastic, but it's irony and sarcasm being used in the same way that Gen X did, which is to deflect back at people. So like the whole okay boomer thing, I
Yeah.
thought that was
I did
hilarious.
too. I loved it.
Because if there's one thing that Gen Xers, millennials, and Gen Z have in common, is that we really hate what boomers have done, which is to leave behind this gigantic mess and wash their hands of it. And so I do think Greta's, people make fun of her, and unfortunately a lot of that is tied up in ableism and fears of people who are on the spectrum, who do tend to be more blunt. But that when she confronts people and says, how dare you, and they know that they did something wrong, and they're not willing to admit it. So yeah, I think that that's another part of young women, is that they can be very threatening and dangerous because they are not willing to accept the status quo a lot of the time.
Yeah. The youth section also included interesting details about young people coming to learn about the lies of purity culture within religion, which I found to be incredibly fascinating for obvious reasons for the podcast. But they come to understand these lies once they are trapped within marriages.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious about some of the moments that stand out to you when learning about the inner workings of the purity culture movement and reporting on that as well.
One of the things that's been interesting about becoming a religion journalist is how many people I've met who grew up in evangelicalism and then have either stayed in it and tried to make a change, kind of like some of us have done with Catholicism, or left and converted to something else, or are nuns, NONES, which was the subject of my last book. Or they're ex-evangelicals. Anyway, it's a whole landscape. But one thing I've learned from them, and I found really interesting, is how purity culture really mirrored and took from the Catholic obsession with things like virgin martyrs.
Yeah.
So women's saints who died to protect their virginity versus male saints who died to protect their country or their town, or something like that. And so it's the parallels between purity culture's emphasis on saving yourself from marriage and protecting your sexuality. It's really about men, because it's taking the responsibility that men have not to, like the obsession with what people are wearing. So if a woman's boobs being visible in a low cut shirt bothers you, that's your problem, not hers.
Yeah.
And that whole putting it, like, men are sort of like, purity culture and Catholicism have this in common, which is that the responsibility of men is to not be, to control themselves is put on women, not on men. And so that's tied up in so many things like rape culture and how we handle sexual violence and sexual harassment and stuff like that. It's all the onus is on women. Why did you walk home at night? Why did you go to that party rather than the men? So that's one thing that purity culture that stood out to me about that. And then also just how long it takes for people to disentangle those ideas, and that it's a lifetime, like I was talking about earlier, of when you're in a heterosexual relationship, how you really have to work against the expectations of a normative heterosexual relationship and deconstruct your own ideas of how your gender is supposed to act. It's the same thing with sex. For people who grew up in purity culture, that the guilt and the shame, and hey, Catholics have that too. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Thinking back on the big picture of the book here, I'm wondering if there has been anything that's happened past the publication of the book that you wish were in it. Are you still thinking about these ideas and are like wondering about what you would put in it if you were writing it now?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic again has exposed how a lot of these gendered expectations are still very entrenched. And I think that not only makes, the things I was writing about here relevant, but it also opens the path for a lot more people to be discussing and talking about these issues, both privately and in the public square. And for academics, one of the things that's really important is to remember that too much of the time academics write for other academics, and that a lot of the ideas that I discovered about theology and history and gender studies are things that should be written about for a wider audience. And so I do hope, to return to some of these topics, but I think that idea of deconstructing our own, I'm sorry, I hate the word deconstructing because
It's fine.
I went to grad school in the time when that meant Derrida. So
Yes.
when I hear ex-evangelicals talking about it now, I'm like, I can't get out of that. But so I would say self-examination, self-examining our own gender performance, as Judith Butler puts it. How do we act out our gender? How do we inhabit our gender? And how young adults are like, just throwing that all out the window and are just like, I don't know what my gender is, and that's okay.
Yeah.
It's like they are so at peace with being in a liminal gender space that I would love to watch what happens with that and continue to think about that. I wrote a little bit about it in the book, but I think it's going to just become more and more commonplace.
You have an opening quote in the book that on the dedication page that reads, quote, "Women in time will come to do much." This was said by Mary Ward, who lived from 1585 to 1645. And I'm wondering if you can tell me your thoughts on this quote as we kind of bring this conversation in for a landing.
The quote is one that has meant a lot to me for a long time. Mary Ward was the leader of she wanted to start a religious order that was a female version of the Jesuits. So it would have been an order where women were teachers and they went out into the world. And particularly, she wanted women to teach other women how to read and write. And she was imprisoned for that. And she had a very difficult life, but she continued to, persist. And that quote, I think the fact that it was said by somebody who sacrificed a lot of her own self in order to improve the lives of other women is something that still means a lot to me today, but also I think that reveals how much work we still have to do.
Gotcha. Well, I'm wondering, Kaya, if you can tell people where they can find your work if they want to follow along with what you do in the future and get to know your work a little bit better.
Sure. So I, like many journalists, I'm sucked in by Twitter a lot of the time, more than any other social media platform. So I'm there as at Kaya Oakes, Kyaoakes. My website is, if you just Google me, it'll be the top search result. Books are available anywhere books are sold. And I have a little faculty page at UC Berkeley that showcases my teaching. So I'm all over the place, but I'm on the internet.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've had an absolute blast chatting with you.
Thanks for having me.
About this
Yeah.
fantastic book, The Defiant Middle. Everybody go check it out. So thank you so much for being here.
Happy to join you. Thanks, Greg.